the dreamers, when Innocence took the cross. Let me take you to a moment not of war, but of wonder, not of steel, but of sandals, not of kings and banners, but of barefoot children walking toward what they believed was destiny. The year was 1212. Europe was exhausted, spiritually bruised from one failed crusade after another. Jerusalem, the jewel of Christendom, remained in Muslim hands. Kings had marched. Thousands had died. The holy city remained untouched, as if mocking every sword raised in its name. And then came the whisper. A child in France, another in Germany. They claimed to have heard the voice of Christ himself, not in Latin scrolls or papal edicts, but in dreams, in visions. Take up the cross, he had told them. Jerusalem will be freed not by warriors, but by the innocent. And they believed. They were not soldiers. They were shepherd boys, orphans, daughters of bakers, sons of beggars. Some were barely 8 years old. They had no money, no food, no armor, but they had faith. And in a world crumbling under corruption and cynicism, that was the most radical thing of all. One of them was named Stephen, a 12-year-old from the village of Cloires in France. He stood on crates in the market, his voice rising above the clamor of commerce. Christ has chosen us. He cried, "We are his army, and he will part the sea as he did for Moses." People laughed, and then people followed. Because sometimes the world is so broken that it can't hear the truth unless it comes from the lips of a child. Within weeks, thousands had gathered, children, teenagers, widows, the poor and the desperate. Some priests tried to stop them. Some merchants gave them bread. But no one, not even the Pope, could explain why these children marched. They sang hymns as they walked. They carried wooden crosses. They shared crusts of bread and whispered prayers by moonlight. In town after town, villagers came out not to mock, but to weep. Because in those children's eyes was something Europe had not seen in a long, long time, unshakable belief. They believed the sea would part. They believed angels would guide their steps. They believed that the gates of Jerusalem would open not to siege towers, but to song. And perhaps the most terrifying thing is that they weren't wrong to believe in something. They were wrong to trust the world would protect it, because waiting for them was betrayal. Waiting for them was slavery. But that comes later. First, we march. We march through forests and famine. We march with a boy named Nicholas, who would lead thousands over the Alps without maps, without shoes, only with a vision he swore was holy. We march into a Europe that had lost its soul and found it, briefly, reflected in the innocent faces of children who dared to believe they could bring back Jerusalem with nothing but their feet. But hope is a dangerous thing in the hands of the naive. And this story is not a miracle. It is a warning. The roads stretched endlessly. What began as a rumor became a movement, sprawling, chaotic, but undeniably real. Across France, across Germany, the children gathered like flocks drawn by an unseen shepherd. Some held rags for cloaks. Others carried relics, a saint's tooth, a broken rosary, a pebble from a shrine. They had no maps, but they had direction. South, they said, to the sea, to Jerusalem. Behind them, their villages faded into memory. Parents wept at gates. Some begged their children to return. Others, crippled by fear or faith, let them go believing this might truly be a miracle. That perhaps Innocence could do what all the armies of Europe had failed to do. Stephen of Cloyes led the French. Nicholas of Cologne led the Germans. 2 children, barely past puberty, hailed as prophets. And Europe listened. Crowds gathered at crossroads just to see the procession. Priests debated in hushed tones. Kings took note. But no one stopped them. Why would they? This wasn't a rebellion. This wasn't a war. This was hope. walking. But soon, hope met hunger. The first real challenge was not enemy swords but empty bellies. The bread ran out, water grew scarce. Some towns refused to feed them, others turned them away in fear. Thieves began to follow. Wolves too. Still, they marched. At night, they slept in ditches, barns, or under open skies. They sang hymns when they were cold. Some believed each step was burning away their sins. Others whispered that the angels had begun walking with them unseen, but always present. Nicholas claimed the Alps would open for them, that no child would perish, that God would protect his army. But the Alps did not open, and God did not protect. Snow fell in June. Children slipped on the rocks. Dozens vanished in the blizzards. Some were buried in shallow graves, hastily marked with sticks and prayers. Others turned back, but most pressed on, because turning back meant admitting they had been wrong, and none of them could afford to believe that. By the time the German group descended from the mountains, they were thinner, quieter, older in spirit, though still only children in age. They reached Genoa, a port city, with blistered feet and empty hands, hoping to find ships that would carry them to the Holy Land. But there were no ships. The sea did not part. The miracle never came. For some, that was the breaking point. Others clung to the belief that God was merely testing their faith. And then came the merchants, men from Marseille, promising transport. "You've walked far enough," they said. "Let the sea carry you now, for free, a gift to the holy cause." 7 ships, over 1,000 children. They boarded with songs and prayers. None of them reached Jerusalem. The sea should have been their salvation. For weeks, they had wandered, driven not by commanders or kings, but by the conviction that faith alone could part oceans. So when the ships appeared in Marseille gleaming with promise, offered freely by 2 smiling merchants, many wept, not from fear, but from relief. The miracle, they believed, had arrived. 7 ships, timber hulls worn by the salt of the Mediterranean, yet mighty in the eyes of children. To them, these were not vessels, they were arks, instruments of divine mercy, meant to carry them across the waters like a second Exodus. They boarded in droves, boys clutching splinters of the true cross, girls humming lullabies they'd learned from mothers they might never see again. Some had never seen the ocean before. The sails unfurled, and with them, so did the illusion, because there was no Jerusalem waiting at the other side, no angels guiding the wind, no knights on the shore ready to embrace the holy children. What awaited them, if they arrived at all, was Tunisia. And chains. Of the 7 ships, 2 were reportedly lost in storms off the coast of Sardinia. Hundreds of children drowned, dragged to the bottom with hymns still on their lips. The remaining vessels reached North Africa not to the Holy Land, but to the markets of Alexandria, of Tunis, of Algiers. They were not met by saints. They were met by slave traders. The merchants who had offered them safe passage had made a different arrangement altogether, silver for each child, sold like cargo, like cattle. Boys were separated from girls. Older children were prized as laborers. The younger ones were bartered off to households or vanished into harems. A few were beaten for resistance. Some tried to run, others simply went quiet. No letters made it home. No pope issued a rescue. The silence was as absolute as the betrayal, and still some did survive. Years later, a handful of witnesses emerged. One claimed he'd been purchased by a kind scribe in Cairo and taught to read. Another escaped and joined a monastic order in Sicily, never again speaking of the sea. Their accounts were fragmentary, haunted, stitched with gaps and whispers. But they all confirmed one thing: there had been no crusade, only a harvest of hope, and a marketplace that paid in tears. Back in Europe, confusion reigned. Some claimed the whole story was a myth. Others said the children had sinned and been punished. The church made no official reckoning. The nobles turned their eyes elsewhere. Only the common people remembered passing the tale in hushed tones, like a ghost story for grown men. But memory is a strange thing. It does not die easily when carved into absence. So for generations, the story of the Children's Crusade lingered not in official chronicles, but in lullabies, in warnings, in the way mothers clutched their sons a little tighter when the wind came from the south. The children had believed they would reach Jerusalem by faith alone, but what they discovered was a harsher revelation that the world would devour even the purest dreams, and that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not the failure of a crusade, but the fact that no one came to stop it. The ports went quiet after the ships disappeared. In Marseille, the docks that once echoed with the songs and laughter of children grew still. The merchants who had promised salvation closed their doors, and as weeks turned into months, and the tide failed to return any word, a quiet dread settled across southern France and the Rhine Valley. Parents who had watched their children march away now sat in pews, asking the same question again and again. Where are they? But there was no answer. The church, perhaps ashamed, perhaps fearful, refused to speak. There was no papal decree of mourning, no public mass of remembrance, no Crusader hymn for the vanished, only a ripple of guilt too soft to stir action, too deep to be erased. And so, the stories began. In the absence of fact, Europe crafted myth. Some said the children had reached Jerusalem, unarmed and barefoot, and the Muslim defenders, struck by their purity, surrendered the city without a fight. Others whispered of betrayal, of ships that never docked, of buyers waiting with coins and chains. The tale split into many branches, each shaped by the hopes and horrors of those who told it. In one version, the sea itself betrayed them, swallowing 500 children in a single storm, the waves foaming with crosses and rosaries. In another, angels disguised as sailors guided the innocent across secret waters, delivering them to heaven rather than Jerusalem. But in every version, one truth remained. They were gone, and Europe was changed. The Children's Crusade became more than a tragedy. It became a scar, a reminder that faith, without wisdom, could become a weapon turned inward, that even the purest intentions, when cast into a cruel world, could be twisted into nightmares. For years after, villagers warned their children of false prophets. Priests preached of discernment, not just devotion. And yet beneath the surface, the legend kept growing, because there was something intoxicating about the idea that the young, untrained, uncorrupted, could succeed where emperors had failed. That holiness lived not in crowns or cathedrals, but in the cracked feet of a child walking toward the impossible. And perhaps that is what made the Children's Crusade so dangerous. Not just because of what happened, but because of what it promised. A vision too beautiful to survive the world it walked into, and yet, one too haunting to ever let go. Across Europe, time moved on, but not for the parents left waiting. In the villages of Cloise and Cologne, the names of the missing children were whispered at sunset, spoken like prayers or curses. Some mothers insisted their child would return, even years later refusing to clean the room, refusing to harvest the land where they last saw them standing. Fathers, hardened by war and toil, drank in silence or wept alone in barns. It was not just a generation lost, it was a future undone. Yet still, there were no tombs, no graves to mark, no bodies to bury. And that, in many ways, was the cruelest wound of all. Because grief needs form, it needs finality. But these children had vanished, not into the Holy Land, but into legend, into shame, into absence. For the church, the episode was an embarrassment best forgotten. Records were lost, letters unacknowledged. In the official chronicles of Christendom, the Children's Crusade became little more than a footnote, a warning, perhaps, but not a memorial. But the people remembered, and from that memory came stories. In cloisters and castles, bards sang of a girl who calmed a storm with a hymn, of a boy whose tears turned brackish water sweet, of a child who met death with open arms, believing that the next breath would be taken in Jerusalem itself. Truth, fantasy, and sorrow bled together until they were inseparable. And so, generation by generation, the Children's Crusade became not just a historical event, but a mirror of what faith can inspire and destroy, a reflection of what happens when purity meets politics, when innocence walks into the arms of power. But perhaps the most haunting part of all, they had believed, truly, fully, dangerously believed. They had believed that the world would listen to goodness, that holiness would make them safe, that seas would split and gates would open not by sword, but by song. They had believed that being righteous was the same as being right, and history, cold, brutal, unforgiving, had answered them with silence. So, if you listen closely on certain nights, when the wind rises off the Mediterranean and the moon cuts the clouds above Marseille, they say you can still hear them, not screaming, not marching, but singing. And yet, as strange as it may sound, many did not see themselves as victims. For a time, those children walking dusty paths, blistered and starving, believed they were doing something no army had ever dared, storming the gates of heaven with nothing but innocence in their hands. They saw themselves not as lambs led to slaughter, but as chosen ones, heralds of a second Exodus, martyrs in the making. They carried their pain as penance. When rain lashed their backs, they called it baptism. When towns refused them bread, they recited scripture. When one of them collapsed on the road, they whispered that he would be first to see the holy city. Every loss became a sign, every hardship a test, because they had to believe, if not in Jerusalem, then in meaning. And meaning is what they clung to long after food ran out. They walked past graves of failed crusaders, past burned-out monasteries and forgotten castles where kings had once feasted and failed. And still, they sang, but singing could not feed them. Faith could not mend broken ankles or cure dysentery. As they crossed borders, what began as admiration turned to suspicion. Some towns barred their gates, others mocked them. Rumors spread that they were not pilgrims, but pests, that they brought disease, that they were possessed. A child prophet is inspiring until he becomes inconvenient. In the Alps, dozens died of exposure, their bodies hidden beneath snowdrifts that would not thaw until summer. In Lombardy, some were imprisoned for blasphemous behavior. In Genoa, the doors of the cathedral were locked when they approached, not because the priests lacked compassion, but because they feared the weight of so many unanswered prayers. And still, Nicholas kept walking. His hair matted with sweat, his robes torn by thorns. Behind him, hundreds limped in silence. Some no longer prayed. Others stopped speaking entirely, as if words had failed them. What had once been a procession of joy had become a funeral march without coffins. But he would not turn back. He claimed he had seen the angels, that they had shown him the path, that even if every child died, their souls would open the gates of Jerusalem. But what Nicholas didn't understand, what none of them could, was that sometimes a vision is not enough. Sometimes faith must kneel before cruelty, and cruelty, as they would soon learn, never kneels. By the time the remnants of the French and German groups reached the southern ports Marseille, Genoa, and Pisa, they were not pilgrims. They were ghosts. What began with trumpets and tears had now become something quieter, sadder. Most of the children were barefoot. Some had no clothes at all. Many could no longer walk and had to be carried. A few had lost their minds completely, speaking only in psalms or staring at the horizon, as if Jerusalem might rise out of the sea like a miracle. And yet, they still believed. Because when you've come so far, when you've bled and cried and lost everything, the lie becomes too precious to abandon. You wrap it around yourself like a cloak. You wear it to keep out the wind. You feed it to your soul when your stomach is empty. It stops being a vision and becomes a reason to breathe. So they went to the ports and waited for ships that would not come, for salvation that had never been promised. Some local clergy gave them bread and beds, moved more by pity than piety. Others turned them away, afraid that hosting so many lost, broken children would spark unrest or disease. The cities had seen crusades before real ones, with knights and banners and coin. These children were not a crusade. They were an embarrassment, a theological wound. And in that space between miracle and mockery stepped the merchants. They had names like Hugo and William. They dressed in silks, spoke with warmth, and smiled with teeth. They claimed to be men of God. They promised ships. "You will go to Jerusalem," they said. "You will arrive in glory." And the children believed. Because when you're desperate, belief becomes easy. It becomes necessary. So they boarded. They prayed as the ropes were cast off, sang hymns as the coastline slipped away. They watched the water sparkle like stars and thought it must be a sign. That surely, this was the Red Sea, and soon it would part. But the sea did not part. The horizon held no city of gold, only silence and sails, and the slow realization that no one on board was looking east. Days passed at sea, then weeks, and with every passing sunset, the silence grew heavier. There were no hymns anymore, only coughing, only the groan of timber and the creak of sails under uncertain winds. The children began to ask questions, but the sailors offered no answers. When asked how far to Jerusalem, they laughed. When asked about the coastlines they passed, they gave no names. When asked for water, they grew cold. Some children prayed harder. Others began to weep. And still, the ships pressed south past Sicily, past Malta, down into warmer, crueler waters. The moment of truth did not come with a crash or cry. It came with stillness. The ships docked not in the Levant, not near holy ground, but in the ports of North Africa. Alexandria, Tunis, Algiers. There was no cathedral to greet them, only stone wharfs, armed men, and markets open, waiting, and buyers. The children were herded ashore, confused. Some smiled, thinking this must be a stop on the way to Jerusalem. Others trembled, sensing the shift. The captains, those pious merchants who promised God's mission, spoke in hushed tones with men in robes and armor. And then it happened, not all at once, but in fragments. A boy, pulled from the crowd. A girl, struck when she tried to flee. The group separated. Shouts in languages they didn't understand. Chains, shackles, wailing. It was not a mistake. It was not an accident. It was a sail. They had never been crusaders. They had been cargo. For each child, a price. For each prayer, a coin. They were not seen as holy, only profitable. And the markets of the Mediterranean had long memories, long appetites. Some children were bought as house servants, others for labor, in vineyards and salt mines. A few, God help them, were taken into darker fates, hidden behind doors that never opened again. And so ended the children's crusade, not in glory, not in bloodshed, but in silence, in sand, in sail. Of the thousands who marched from Europe, only a handful would ever return. Some escaped. A few were ransomed years later. Others were absorbed into the cultures that had enslaved them, raised as Muslims, forgotten by name, but remembered in story. Their families never knew. The church said little, and Europe moved on. But the myth did not die, because people needed it. They needed to believe that faith had mattered, even if it had ended in betrayal, that the innocence of children could still mean something, even if the world had crushed it. So, over time, the tale became blurred. Some said the children had vanished into heaven, taken up like Elijah. Others believed they had arrived in Jerusalem. After all, only the faithful could see it. But the truth was starker, crueler, and far more important. The truth was this: when children believe in something greater than themselves, they become powerful, and when the world sees that power, it either protects it or profits from its destruction. And in 1212, the world chose profit. Back in Europe, time passed, but for the families who had given their children to the wind. It stood still. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. Harvests came and went. But no letters arrived. No ships returned. No voices called out from the horizon. The pilgrimage had vanished as if swallowed by the sea, as if God himself had taken them without a word. At first, there was confusion. Then came the rumors. Some said the children had arrived in the Holy Land and were living in glory under the protection of angels. Others claimed they had sinned, that their pride had offended God, and they had been punished with death. A few whispered of storms, of shipwrecks, of divine wrath. But the truth, the raw, unbearable truth, was harder to speak aloud. That they had been sold, that faith had made them vulnerable, that their innocence had been a currency in the hands of men with no gods at all. The church, perhaps too ashamed to confront its own passivity, said little. Pope Innocent III, when finally informed, is said to have remarked, "These children put us to shame, for they rushed to recover the Holy Land while we slept." It was a statement drenched in irony and sorrow. But there were no masses said in their name, no altars raised, no days of mourning. And so the grief of the children's crusade became private, buried. Villages spoke of it only in metaphor. Monks copied down fragments of the tale, often cloaking it in parable. Mothers, whose arms would never again feel the warmth of their sons, whispered the story into lullabies, songs of lost doves, of journeys never finished, of dreams that walk into the sea and do not return. And yet, something else lingered, a kind of sacred ache, a sense that something holy had tried to take root in the world and had been crushed before it could flower, that perhaps the children had touched a truth too dangerous for the world to allow, a truth about purity, about faith, about courage uncorrupted by politics or pride. And even in their absence, that truth remained. In candlelit chapels, where their names were scratched into stone, in faded tapestries that showed children marching under the sign of the cross, in the way old women still lit candles on certain days, not for saints, but for children they never knew, because the world had taken their lives, but not their story. And as long as the story endured, so did they. They had gone singing, and now they were silent. But silence has weight. It gathers in corners. It creeps into sermons and settles beneath the skin of memory. And so, even as the years passed and the names of the missing faded from parchment, the children's crusade refused to die. In truth, it became something else. A myth, yes, but also a warning. A parable of purity punished. A shadow of what happens when devotion meets exploitation. In the back halls of cathedrals, where bishops debated policy and penance, there were moments when a name would rise, Stephen, Nicholas, and a silence would follow, heavy with everything unsaid. Even among warriors and kings, there were those who carried the tale like a wound. Knights who had watched those barefoot pilgrims pass through their villages, believing in things the sword had long abandoned. Crusaders who returned from the Holy Land and heard what had happened in their absence, only to feel shame deeper than any defeat. They had fought with armor and steel. The children had fought with faith alone. And in the end, both had bled. But the deepest echo was not in court or church. It was in the eyes of children yet to be born, because mothers told the story differently, not as a tale of triumph or failure, but as a lullaby carved from pain, a reminder that not all who march beneath the cross are protected, that faith must walk with wisdom, that the world does not change simply because it should. And yet, there was something in the march of those children that would not be erased, something terrifying, something holy, a glimpse of what might have been if only the world had been worthy. For in their steps, Europe glimpsed its soul and found it lacking. It said that when the last of the children vanished from sight, something shifted in the very soil of Europe. No trumpets heralded their departure. No banners waved on their return. Only a long, aching absence where laughter used to echo in fields and chapels. The children had been the light in villages racked by plague, war and famine. Their faith wild, untamed. Unschooled had been a fire too bright for the age. And once that fire was extinguished, darkness returned, not with violence, but with doubt. For the first time in a century of crusades, people began to ask questions no priest could answer. If the purest among us can be betrayed, who is safe if God would not part the sea for children? What hope was there for kings and castles? And if salvation could be sold for silver, was it ever real? The theologians tried to contain it. Some declared the Crusader sin, born of arrogance. Others blamed heresy. A few even claimed the children were never real, just a story to frighten wayward souls. But the people knew better. They had seen the children march. They had fed them, sung with them, wept as they left. The children's crusade became a kind of forbidden memory, not banned by decree, but buried by shame. And yet, it lingered, in art, in dreams, in the low hum of legends told by candlelight. There were paintings crude and haunting of children walking over waves, with halos lit by the dying sun. In some, the sea weeps. In others, the angels turn their faces away. A few monasteries kept secret scrolls, fragments of songs the children had sung. We do not need a sword. One line reads, "For God is our captain, and heaven is near." But heaven had not been near. Only chains, only lies. Only the quiet desperation of young eyes realizing they had been led not to salvation, but to slaughter. And yet, still, somehow their story remained holy. Not in triumph, not in conquest, but in its brutal, unapologetic truth, that the world, left to its own devices, will devour what is most beautiful, that faith, unguided, can become a feast for monsters, that even God's silence speaks volumes. Because in every village that once emptied to feed the cause, new songs were born, not of battle, but of caution, of remembrance, and of justice still owed. They called them the Lost Crusaders, the Innocents, the Martyrs of the Sea. And some believed, still believe, that one day, when the world is quieter, when swords are sheathed and the tide is still, a voice will rise from the deep, a voice of a child, not crying for help, but calling us home. The pilgrimage, across mountains and misery. The roads were quiet now, where once 1,000 feet had trampled paths through forests and valleys. Only wind moved through the grass. What remained of the children's crusade lived not in camps or cities, but in whispers, in scars, and in the hollow silence left behind. In Germany, a boy named Johannes returned alone, years older than he should have been. yet with the eyes of a man 3 times his age. His mother didn't recognize him at first. His voice had changed. He limped, and when asked where the others were, he said nothing, only looked to the east and trembled. He never married, never spoke of what he had seen, only sat by the river on summer evenings, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick, as if the names of his friends were buried there just beneath the surface, waiting to be rewritten. And he was not alone. A girl in the Rhone Valley was found in a convent, cloaked in rags, calling herself Pilgrim of the Salt. She refused to eat bread, only roots and berries. She claimed her sins had sunk the ships. The priests tried to heal her with prayer, but she laughed when they mentioned God. He doesn't speak to children. She said, only about them. What Europe had witnessed was not just a failed crusade, it was the unraveling of a belief that innocence was a shield, that faith alone could defy the dark. And yet, faith didn't die. It evolved. New sects sprang up, devoted to spiritual childhood. Some saw the children not as victims, but as saints-in-waiting martyrs who had been taken not by man, but by divine ascension. A cult in the Pyrenees built a shrine to the Weeping Cross, a stone where, they claimed, a child had cried blood the day the ships disappeared. Others took a harder stance. In Rome, a sermon warned against the arrogance of the young, using the children's fate as proof that only trained knights and anointed kings should lead the holy cause. The Pope ordered the message copied and spread, but he did not mention the merchants, did not mention the betrayal. Perhaps he feared what everyone else did, that the real monster had not come from the east, but from within. And yet, even in the darkest corners of the story, a strange light persisted. Because while the Children's Crusade had failed as a mission, it had succeeded in something else. It had held a mirror to Christendom, and the reflection was unbearable. The corridors of power were not silent, even if the pulpits were, beneath vaulted ceilings and behind closed doors. Bishops and monarchs exchanged uneasy glances. The Children's Crusade had exposed a flaw too large to ignore, not in the zeal of the young, but in the machinery of Christendom itself. It had shown how easily holy purpose could be twisted, how piety could be packaged, bought, and sold. And worst of all, it had shown the Church's silence. To the nobility, the story became a political threat. If children could be led into ruin by faith alone, what would stop others from rising with the same blind hope? Faith had always been a tool useful in the hands of kings, dangerous in the hands of peasants. The line between belief and rebellion had grown thinner with every barefoot march. In Paris, officials debated whether Stephen of Cloyes had ever truly heard from God, or merely from a local priest hoping to spark rebellion. In Cologne, rumors swirled that Nicholas had been a puppet of radical monks seeking to undermine the Pope. No evidence was ever found, but the accusations revealed a deeper fear that the children had not been led by heaven, but by the disillusionment festering in Europe's soul, and the people, those who still lit candles, who still knelt in broken pews, began to ask quieter, more dangerous questions. If the Church could not protect its most faithful, if it could not stop merchants from turning pilgrims into property, if it could not even name the children it had blessed as Crusaders, what, exactly? Was it for pilgrimage numbers declined in the following years? Donations dropped. Entire towns that had once answered the call to crusade with cheers now met it with silence. The holy fire had not gone out, but it burned lower, more bitterly. And into that vacuum stepped something new. Stories. Not decrees, not sermons, but stories told in taverns, written in hidden corners of monasteries, whispered by mothers to daughters. Stories of betrayal and purity, of children who walked with angels, of a God who watched and wept. It was not theology. It was myth, but myth has power, because unlike a papal bull, it cannot be revoked. And unlike a king's promise, it cannot be broken. So the Children's Crusade, though shattered, endured not on parchment, but in memory, as a wound, as a warning, as a truth too terrible to tell and too sacred to forget. Time turned the horror into legend, but not mercy. Across Europe, the tale of the children who vanished became more than memory. It became myth. It fed the brush of painters, the ink of scribes, and the fire of preachers. But like all myths, it mutated. In some regions, the children were saints, halos drawn crudely above their heads in stained glass windows, their tiny feet poised as if stepping across waves. In others, they were fools, symbols of arrogance punished by divine judgment. A cautionary tale sewn into sermons, warning against the pride of challenging God's ordained order. The truth raw, complex, painful was buried, but it never rotted. In art, their story appeared in tapestries and murals, always walking, always west to east. Sometimes they reached Jerusalem, sometimes the sea swallowed them. Often they floated in limbo, neither saved nor damned, but suspended in the space between. No artist dared paint them in chains. Few painted the ships. No one painted the merchants. In literature, the Children's Crusade inspired epics, tragedies, and fables. A German monk wrote of an invisible city beneath the waves, built by the souls of lost pilgrims. An Italian poet imagined one boy reaching Jerusalem alone, only to find the gates locked, his voice unheard by angels who mistook him for a ghost. In these retellings, the line between history and parable vanished. But in the hearts of common folk farmers, bakers, fishermen, the story remained deeply human. They remembered the faces, they remembered the songs, and they passed them down. In the Rhineland, old women sang a lullaby called Das verlorene Kreuz, the lost cross said to soothe infants and summon dreams of a world where no child walks alone. In southern France, midsummer fires were lit for the vanished, and children danced in circles, reenacting a march with no destination. But not all echoes were gentle. In the 14th century, when plague returned and trust in God faltered once again, radical sects pointed to the Children's Crusade as the first betrayal proof that the Church had long abandoned its people. Some rebelled. Some built new doctrines on that wound. The fire that had begun as innocence would smoulder into heresy. And beneath it all, one question refused to die. What if they had been right? What if their faith had indeed been purer? What if the sin was not their naivety, but the world's refusal to follow? In the shadow of that vanished march, the Church found itself walking a tighter rope. No council would ever name the Children's Crusade a holy war. No pope would canonize its leaders. No relics would be enshrined. No miracles officially recognized. It was a failure too painful to honor, too public to erase. But in its quiet refusal to speak, the Church invited something more dangerous than condemnation, doubt. And from doubt came division, Over time, the story of the children became a weapon not against Islam or heretics, but against the very institution that had failed to guide them. Preachers in the countryside invoked it to criticize the luxury of bishops. Mystics claimed visions from the lost, calling for a purer faith. Pilgrims asked why the Vatican had blessed soldiers, but ignored the Song of Innocence. The divide between cathedral and cottage deepened. Even among the clergy, the silence cracked. Some monks whispered that the children had indeed seen visions, that theirs was the true call, and the Church had missed it. A few dissidents began to write of a spiritual crusade, not of arms or armor, but of simplicity, humility, and radical grace. These ideas, once dangerous, began to take root. The Crusade of the Innocents had ended in betrayal, but its story became a spark. And not all sparks die. By the end of the 13th century, new movements emerged. Preachers walking barefoot through towns, calling for reform, hermits who claimed the church had lost its way, communities that rejected wealth and hierarchy in favor of shared suffering and silent prayer. They didn't call themselves Crusaders, but they carried the same flame. It would take centuries for these seeds to fully bloom into protest, into reformation, into revolution. But the soil had been broken by the feet of children, and in the quiet corners of Europe, where candles burned low and prayers were whispered with more fear than faith, the old song remained, not of swords, not of saints, but of those who dared to walk east, chasing a vision the world could not understand. The echo of the children's crusade did not end in parchment or pulpit. It bled into identity. For generations, families spoke of lost cousins, siblings, friends, names half remembered but never erased. In marketplaces and monasteries, the legend of those who marched east became a part of European childhood itself. To be young, to believe, to walk unarmed toward the unknown, it was no longer a historical event. It was a type of soul. Children born decades later were still told stories before bed, not of dragons or saints, but of real children who had walked to God and disappeared. And for many, that story wasn't one of defeat. It was one of courage the world didn't deserve. Some poets began calling them the barefoot martyrs, holy because they had not killed. Others compared them to lambs led to slaughter not in sin, but in sacrifice. The older the tale grew, the more it became a mirror in which every generation saw its own failures reflected. Crusades would come and go, launched by popes, fought by kings, funded by taxes, but none would ever carry the strange, haunting purity of the Children's March. Their story was not of conquest, but of loss, not of glory, but of grief. And in that, it became more powerful than any victory, because the Children's Crusade revealed something terrible and true, that faith, when unguarded by power, is vulnerable. That belief without guidance can be weaponized by greed. That hope, unprotected, is the most dangerous thing a child can carry. But it also showed something else, that even in failure, even in betrayal, there is beauty in belief, in the courage of children who marched not for crowns, but for Christ, who walked not to kill, but to witness, who disappeared, but were never truly gone. And as Europe changed, as empires rose and fell, as wars raged and borders shifted, there was always, somewhere, a chapel candle lit for them, always a bell rung in some remote village, always a moment of silence when a child stood at the edge of the sea, looking east, listening, just in case the ships returned. There were no monuments raised in their names, no stone walls etched with their prayers, no battlefields hallowed by their blood. And yet, they remained woven into the fabric of every sermon that dared to speak of sacrifice, into every church bell that rang at dusk, into the silence that followed when no one knew what to say, only that something holy had been broken, and the pieces never found. Some say the Children's Crusade left behind no history, only myth. But myth, when it echoes long enough, becomes truth. And that truth lingered in unexpected places. In the hesitation of a bishop before blessing another war, in the faces of knights who, years later, passed barefoot pilgrims on dusty roads and felt a pang they could not name, in the way a mother clutched her child tighter during Sunday Mass when the priest spoke of God's will and holy duty. It lingered in song too. A hymn emerged in the Alps, sung in secret during Lent we walk, not to return. It was never attributed, but the verses were unmistakable, speaking of barefoot travelers, of betrayal by ships, of a sea that did not part but swallowed. It was banned in several dioceses. It survived anyway, because Europe never quite healed. The Children's Crusade became a question it could not answer, a prayer without an amen. And so it haunted not like a ghost, but like a memory that refused to die. And that is perhaps its greatest legacy. Not that it changed doctrine, not that it ended war, but that it reminded the world, however briefly, what faith looked like when unshaped by greed. What devotion meant before it was taxed, weaponized, or translated into politics. It reminded the world what it had lost, and for a time, just a breath in the grand march of history, that was enough to make even kings look east and wonder what the children saw. In the centuries that followed, the Children's Crusade was rarely mentioned in official chronicles. When it was, it came with a warning, a footnote on folly, a lesson in zeal untempered by wisdom. But the people remembered, not because they needed to, but because they couldn't forget. They had seen too many of their own walk away and never return, and so the legend became part of the European soul. It whispered through the cracks of cathedrals. It echoed in the chants of candle-lit processions. It bled into paintings, prayers, and stories passed down by those who knew that truth wasn't only what the church sanctioned, it was also what it couldn't bring itself to speak. Because the story of the Children's Crusade was never just about faith. It was about betrayal, about what happens when the purest hopes are fed into the jaws of power, and about how even when the world turns away, some stories burn quietly in the dark, keeping the memory alive, not with monuments, but with mourning. In a quiet town near Genoa, a stained glass window still survives. It shows not saints, but children walking over waves, led by a cross made of light. No name is inscribed, no date, only a single word below, in Latin, recordare, remember, and that, in the end, is what they left behind. Not conquest, not relics, but a call that echoes still, to remember them not as symbols, but as children. In France, the shadow of Stephen of Cloyes never quite faded. The village where he was born kept a curious tradition each spring. Children would place small white crosses in the fields, one for each year since his departure. At first, it was a morning ritual, but over time, it became a vigil of hope. Locals whispered that one day, Stephen would return not as a boy, but as a prophet, leading a truer crusade. One born not of armor, but of truth. In the Rhineland, where Nicholas had gathered his followers, the silence was heavier. The German villages that had emptied to follow him became quieter, older, more brittle. The churches there remained intact, but attendance waned. Parents were slower to bless pilgrimage. The road to Cologne, once a river of song, grew still. A few radical priests spoke of Nicholas not as a fool, but as a seer. They were silenced, reassigned, or vanished. Italy responded differently. The port cities, especially Genoa and Pisa, bore the mark of complicity. Some merchants grew wealthy from the trade that followed in the children's wake transport, provisions, even rumors sold for coin. Yet others carried guilt like a second skin. A few shipmasters vanished into monasteries. One merchant, named Alvise, gave away his fortune and died penniless, feeding strangers at the docks each night while muttering prayers to children he couldn't name. In England, far from the center of the tragedy, the Children's Crusade became myth more than memory. Bards turned it into ballads, songs of loss and longing sung in fire-lit halls. One poem, The Bells of the Young, tells of a child who dreams of the Holy Land each night, only to wake and find their village empty. It ends not in despair, but in a promise that one day, all the lost voices will rise together in one final song. Even in the Muslim world, faint echoes reached across the sea. Arab chroniclers in Tunisia and Damascus wrote of European children being sold in coastal markets, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, speaking in tongues no one understood. Some were bought and raised in noble houses. A few converted, became scribes, and vanished into the folds of history. One Persian poet, hearing of the tale, wrote a single line that survives to this day. The lambs walked east, but the shepherds stayed behind. What united all these echoes was not certainty, but ache. The children's crusade had left no relics, no cities conquered, no graves marked, but it had carved something into the heart of Christendom, a scar of silence that no decree could heal. And in that scar, over time, new voices began to gather. Voices that asked not only where the children had gone, but why no one had followed. In the decades that followed, something changed in how Europe treated its children. The church, once eager to anoint youthful zeal, grew cautious. Novices were scrutinized more strictly. Lay movements inspired by visions or miracles were swiftly investigated, often suppressed. The romantic idea of childlike purity leading a spiritual revolution had been tested and found dangerously unpredictable. So, they institutionalized innocence, where once youth had marched to Jerusalem barefoot and unschooled. Now they were placed behind monastery walls. Catechisms became stricter. Schools for the clergy introduced tighter hierarchies, earlier discipline, and doctrinal controls. The very word crusade became tethered once again to knights and nobles, as if to bury the memory that for a brief, luminous moment, it had belonged to children. But in that repression, new questions formed. What made a voice worthy of divine instruction? Was it lineage, age, literacy, or something deeper? Mystics began to whisper that the purity of the children had not been their failure, but their power. That they had been led not by foolishness, but by a raw connection to God that the church feared. This idea gained traction among radical sects, especially in southern France and the Bohemian lands, where quiet revolts of thought simmered beneath the surface. Some began to see the children's crusade not as tragedy, but as prophecy, a failed first attempt, a foretelling of a coming age where the last would be first, and the pure in heart would see God not in gilded halls, but in open fields, among the poor, the barefoot, the brave. And while no papal bull would ever speak of this, the fear could be felt in Rome, not of armies, but of ideas. Because the children had shown something the church could not unsee, that faith, unguarded by hierarchy, moved faster than control, that a single dream, whispered in the wrong ear, could gather thousands, that the holiest fire may burn in places the clergy would never dare walk. So the gates tightened, but the dream remained, in painted icons, in old songs, in the hushed voices of priests who wondered, in the dark corners of their conscience, if they had failed to listen when it mattered most. And in that wondering, history did not end. It waited. In the remote corners of Europe, where cathedrals cast no shadow and Rome's decrees travelled slowly, the children's crusade lived on not in parchment, but in pain. Parents passed down stories, not with reverence, but with warning. Grandmothers whispered to grandchildren about the children who followed the cross and never came home, not to glorify them, but to remember. In tiny chapels tucked into forest valleys, some local priests refused to let the memory die. One parish in Aragon kept a list not official, not blessed of names remembered by the village children who had left and never returned. No canonization, no relics, just names, scratched into wax tablets, lit each year by candles made of sheep tallow and tears. The church said little, but silence has a sound, and in that silence, Europe learned to mourn in its own way, not with pilgrimages, but with vigil, not with banners, but with broken lullabies. In some places, boys were no longer named Nicholas. In others, Stephen became a name invoked not with hope, but with caution. And yet, in a strange twist of history, these children forgotten by the powers they followed became part of the soul of the land itself. They were remembered not for their failure, but for their belief. They had trusted a promise, and that trust, though shattered, remained sacred. So Europe buried them not in tombs, but in story, not in stone, but in sorrow, and in doing so, kept them alive not as heroes, not as saints, but as the last ones to walk toward heaven barefoot, without banners, believing the gates would open, and maybe, just maybe they had. Silence and scars, the crusade that history couldn't hold. They were never meant to be remembered. No king claimed them, no chronicle praised them. And yet, the silence they left behind became a wound too deep for the church to stitch closed. In the decades that followed, Europe changed, but the scar remained. It didn't fade. It darkened. Beneath the roar of new crusades and shifting borders, there pulsed a quiet question, one no council could exorcise. Why were the children abandoned? Not just by the church or by the ships, but by the God they followed. That question bled into theology. It found its way into the letters of monks who no longer trusted Rome, into the journals of midwives who had lost sons, into the songs of herdsmen who had once marched with the children, only to return alone. And from that grief came a slow, smouldering fire, smouldering. Not of armies, but of ideas. A movement began not organized, not declared, but undeniable. It was whispered more than preached, that perhaps faith needed no gold, that holiness did not live only in Rome, that maybe the children had glimpsed a purer path, one that could not survive in a world ruled by popes and princes. This idea took root in unexpected places. Among the Waldensians in the Alps, who preached poverty and scripture in the tongue of commoners, among the Beguines lay women who rejected marriage, wealth, and control, living lives of service outside the church's hierarchy. Among mystics who claimed to see visions not of saints, but of barefoot children dancing in fields of light, beyond the reach of war or crown. They did not call themselves successors of the Children's Crusade, but they walked in its shadow. They bore its pain like a hidden relic. And in doing so, they carried forward its final miracle, not victory. Not martyrdom, but a faith too quiet to burn and too fierce to die. By the dawn of the 14th century, Europe was no longer the continent that had watched its children vanish toward the sea. The empires had shifted. The papacy had grown more powerful and more paranoid. The mendicant orders expanded. The universities rose, and with them came a thirst for doctrine, order, and obedience. But beneath that rising architecture of orthodoxy, cracks ran, deep cracks carved not just by politics or heresy, but by a deeper, quieter grief. Because in the alleys of Avignon, in the fields of Bohemia, and in the monasteries of England, the memory of the children still lived. Not as saints, not as soldiers, but as a question the church could not answer. That question took many forms. Some asked, what does it mean to follow Christ when those most faithful are lost? Others, if the innocent can be sacrificed by holy men, what separates faith from folly? Still others stopped asking aloud. They simply walked away. This spiritual fracture seeded something new, a hunger not just for reform, but for reclamation. The idea that faith had been stolen from the poor, from the young, from the humble and dressed in silk, sealed in Latin, and hidden behind gold, and so they began to peel it back. Peasants began to pray without priests. Women began to teach one another to read. Scripture, once chained to cathedral walls, began to be copied by hand and passed in secret. Faith, once shouted in Latin from gilded pulpits, was now whispered in kitchens and carved into bread crusts. They remembered the children, not for what they achieved, but for what they represented. Not a crusade, but a revelation that the Church, for all its cathedrals and councils, had once stood by as the purest voices walked into betrayal. This became a seed of defiance, and it grew. By the late 1300s, that seed had a name reform. John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus in Bohemia, and many others began to challenge the authority of the Pope, the wealth of the clergy, the absence of scripture in the language of the people. They didn't cite the Children's Crusade directly, but its ghost walked beside them. In every call for simplicity, for access, for justice, there was the echo of thousands of small feet marching east, guided by nothing but hope. It terrified Rome, because what had once been tragedy now fueled revolution, not with swords, but with scripture, not in the Holy Land, but in the minds of the faithful. And this was the legacy no papal bull could silence. A quiet army, born of grief, marching not toward Jerusalem, but toward truth. By the early 15th century, the world of faith had changed, but it had not healed. The Children's Crusade was no longer spoken of in sermons. It was not cited in the encyclicals of Avignon or among the new university debates. It was, officially, a cautionary tale relegated to obscurity. But outside those walls in the commons, in the convents, in the half-burned libraries of wandering preachers, their story smouldered. Among the Hussites, who rose after the martyrdom of Jan Hus in Bohemia, the idea of an uncorrupted faith became a banner. They spoke not of children lost to the sea, but of a church lost to power. Some whispered that the ones who had vanished in 1212 had glimpsed something truer than Rome had ever offered, that their innocence was not weakness, but prophecy. The Hussite wars would ravage the lands, but beneath the clatter of wagons and war hymns was that same thrum the world must change. In the far west, among the Lollards who followed Wycliffe, scripture in the vernacular became their cause. They believed every man and woman had the right to read the Word of God without priest or Latin. Some of them carried a second text anonymous, poetic, and forbidden. It was said to be a retelling of the Children's Crusade, rewritten as parable, The Way of the White Cross. In it, a child leads the blind, and the blind see more clearly than kings. It was burned wherever found. It kept reappearing. Because the Children's Crusade had become more than memory. It had become metaphor, not of a failed expedition, but of a broken contract, between power and faith, between heaven and those who sought it. As Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg a century later, he did not speak of the children, but the crack his hammer made echoed with every story of betrayal told in secret for generations. When the Reformation exploded across Europe, when cathedrals fell and new churches rose, the name of the Children's Crusade was not on the lips of reformers, but its shadow was in every act of defiance. Because they had asked the question no one else dared. What if purity walks faster than power? What if the true church left centuries ago and no one followed? The answer terrified some, inspired others, and thus, the legacy of the Children's Crusade lived on, not in stained glass or scroll, but in every soul who looked at power and chose instead to walk toward the unknown. In every movement that followed, be it reform, rebellion, or quiet heresy, the story of the Children's Crusade became an invisible watermark, not officially cited, not canonized, but felt. It was there in the tears of the Anabaptists drowned for refusing to baptize infants in Latin, in the faces of young Protestant girls caught with forbidden psalms, in the hands of monks who painted small crosses in the margins of their Bibles, not red for blood, but white for innocence. It was there in the idea that sometimes the path to God is clearest not to the learned, but to the lost. And so, even as the Renaissance dawned, and science unfurled new maps, even as reason replaced relics and empires fell to ink and treaty, The Children's March remained a whisper beneath the skin of Christendom. Historians debated its size, its truth, its exaggeration, but the soul knew, because no one who heard the tale truly heard it, walked away unchanged. The Children's Crusade was not just about children. It was about the dream they carried, and the world that could not hold it, about how the purest faith may not be the loudest, nor the most successful, but the one that walks barefoot, unarmed, and unseen, towards something sacred, even if it ends in silence. And in that silence, Europe found a mirror, not of its victories, but of its wounds. The memory endured not because the church preserved it, but because people did. Because in every generation, there are those who feel the call not to war, not to conquest, but to something higher, something beautiful, something lost. And perhaps that's why, in a ruined chapel in southern France, travelers still leave small wooden crosses, each one carved by hand. No two the same. No plaque explains them. No guidebook lists them. But they're always there. A quiet reminder that the children walked first, and that somewhere, their footsteps still echo, long after the last barefoot pilgrim had vanished into the mists of history. The Children's Crusade became more than a story. It became a mirror, a haunting reflection not of what Europe had done, but what it had failed to protect. In taverns and town squares, old men warned the young of listening to sweet-tongued prophets. In convents, young novices were cautioned, obedience is holy, but only when guided by wisdom. Even in royal courts, whispers of the children resurfaced, usually as caution, sometimes as prophecy. One king, it is said, dreamed of being led by a faceless boy through a desert of bones, where the wind wept in the voices of the vanished. He woke with fever, and from that day refused to bless another crusade. Artists painted them pale, luminous, always walking toward a horizon bathed in unnatural light. Poets wrote verses not about glory, but about questions. What kind of God calls children into war? What kind of world follows them into silence? The tale seeped into songs, into sculpture, into superstition. In some mountain villages, mothers braided their daughters' hair while humming laments of the lost ones. In German woods, children were told to leave breadcrumbs not to find their way home, but to remind heaven that they had walked in faith once. 2. Because the Children's Crusade had become myth, and myths, unlike facts, are not judged by truth but by endurance. And this one endured. It outlived kings, outlasted popes. It bled into every moment when faith clashed with doubt, when innocence became a tool, and when hope marched toward betrayal. It taught Europe slowly, painfully, that not all who cry God wills it carry his blessing, that not all pilgrimages end in redemption, and that sometimes the truest saints are the ones no church ever names. So the story was told and retold, each time a little softer, each time a little stranger, but always, always still walking. Because in every heart that still longs for something holy, uncorrupted, and beyond reach, the children walk still. There were those who argued the children were deceived, led astray by charlatans, corrupted by ignorance, abandoned by weak-willed leaders, and perhaps they were. But what if the deeper betrayal was not theirs, but Europe's? What if the real tragedy was that the continent, with all its power and clergy and kings, could not protect its most vulnerable, nor admit, in the centuries after, that it had tried to use them? This discomfort festered not just in doctrine, but in imagination. Writers began to depict crusades not as glory, but as madness. The figure of the child became less a symbol of purity and more a mirror of contradiction, wisdom without language, strength without arms, conviction without cynicism. A danger to the powerful precisely because they had nothing to lose and yet everything at stake. The church may have refused to canonize them, but folk saints they became. not in Rome, but in whispered prayers. In the offerings left at forest shrines no bishop had blessed. In the flicker of candles, lit not for intercession, but for forgiveness. By the 16th century, the Reformation had ripped Europe into fragments, but the story of the Children's Crusade remained whole. It belonged to no side. Lutherans saw in it proof of Rome's corruption. Catholics warned of where unchecked zeal could lead. Anabaptists wept as they remembered what came before their own drownings. It transcended ideology, because in the end, it was not about doctrine. It was about longing, a longing for God so fierce it burned away reason, safety, even survival. And that longing, that fragile, terrible beauty, was the most human thing of all. The Children's Crusade taught a hidden lesson that Europe would take centuries to learn that faith, when stripped of power and politics, becomes something wild, irrational, and deeply sacred, something not to be tamed but remembered. And so the children remain not in Rome, not in Jerusalem, but in the aching space between them, in every story of those who go forth with open hands and return with none. Because that story is not over. It never was. And as long as people search for something pure, something lost, something worth following beyond the edge of reason, the Children's Crusade marches on. If you stand at the edge of the Mediterranean coast, where the sea breaks gently against the stones of Marseille, and close your eyes, you might still hear them. Not in sound, but in memory, a rhythm, ancient and unresolved. The ghost of small feet on sun-warmed stone. The whisper of thousands moving not toward war, but toward wonder, toward Jerusalem, toward heaven, toward something their minds could not name, but their hearts could not deny. This was not just a march, it was a metaphor made flesh. And Europe never recovered. Because while kings returned from their crusades with gold and grudges, and popes sealed treaties with rings and bulls, the children left behind a different kind of inheritance. One that could not be taxed or buried or blessed. A question, a mirror, a wound. What kind of civilization sends its children to die for the sins of its elders? And worse, what kind forgets them? The tragedy of the Children's Crusade was not just in its failure, it was in its erasure. For every noble who raised armies, for every bishop who blessed the sword, there were thousands of small voices that vanished not with a scream, but with a silence so absolute that even history recoiled. And yet, they endured. Not in the records of Rome, but in the folklore of villages where saints had no names and miracles wore peasant shoes. Not in scripture, but in lullabies half remembered by grandmothers who claimed their great-great-grandmothers once saw a child with a white cross sewn into his sleeve walk east and never come back. In these stories, the children became more than real. They became eternal. They wandered forests. They blessed wells. They appeared at crossroads before storms. They were omens of grace or warning, sometimes both. And across the centuries, this memory bent into art. Painters depicted them with gold halos, not because they were saints, but because they were beyond sainthood. They were the dream that the church could never canonize, the raw, unrefined spark of belief before it calcified into dogma, the pilgrimage before the politics. Writers wrestled with their meaning. Were they fools? Were they vessels? Were they God's judgment on a world too cruel to recognize his true disciples? No one knew. But still, they walked. Through wars, through reformations, through revolutions. They walked. When the Enlightenment dawned and reason reigned, philosophers dismissed the story as myth, an exaggeration, a medieval cautionary tale. But in secret, some admitted they wept when they read it, because what is reason against the image of a barefoot child walking across mountains to touch the hand of God? Even the skeptics knew something in the story rang too deep to be fake, because the Children's Crusade did not survive because it was factual. It survived because it was true. True not in its numbers, or its logistics, or even its outcome, but in what it said about the human soul. About the hunger we carry from cradle to grave for something beyond the veil, and about what we are willing to give up our logic, our safety, our children in pursuit of that something, so they march still, in poetry, in rumour, in the silence between bells. And for those who listen truly listen, the sound of their steps is never far. Some say history forgets, but the children's crusade proved otherwise. It was not forgotten because it could not be. Not by those who saw themselves in its reflection. Not by those who recognized, somewhere deep inside, that they too had followed something once some promise, some fire and returned hollow. In time, scholars tried to dissect it. Dates, routes, census estimates. They measured bones, tracked ships, compared versions of the tale across regions. And yet, the more they analyzed, the less they understood, because the heart of the story could not be plotted on a map. It was not about where the children went. It was about what they represented and what they left behind. Their journey became Europe's unspoken confession that in the deepest corridors of its soul, even in cathedrals and palaces, there lived a yearning so ferocious it could possess an entire generation of innocents. That yearning wore many names: redemption, paradise, justice, but in the hands of the children. It was naked, pure, dangerous. That's why the adults followed them not to lead, but to belong, to remember what belief felt like before compromise. And when the children vanished, so did that chance. Some returned, but they were no longer children. They came back with sunken eyes, salt-stiff robes, and silence. They could not explain what had happened. Some could not speak at all. Others told conflicting stories of storms, slavers, cities that closed their gates. And when they cried, it was not for what they had seen. It was for what they had lost inside themselves. Parents didn't know how to welcome them. Priests didn't know how to absolve them. And Europe, perhaps ashamed, did what civilizations often do when faced with truths too holy or too harrowing to hold. It buried them, not in earth but in narrative. The church shifted focus. Chroniclers moved on. And yet, the people, those who whispered by firelight, who prayed without books, who still watched the eastern sky for omens they remembered, because they knew the children had gone somewhere no map could follow. And if you walked long enough, listened deeply enough, and wept without shame, you might meet them, still marching, not toward a city, but toward a question, one that has no answer, only echoes. They vanished without a war. No monuments were raised, no peace treaties bore their names. And yet, century after century, their absence remained louder than any sermon. Some whispered that they never truly died, that they had been taken up not by slavers, nor storms, but by heaven itself, that their journey was not toward Jerusalem on earth, but a kingdom beyond sight. This belief, dismissed by clergy, was cherished in corners where grief had softened into legend. In forests, farmers carved tiny wooden sandals and hung them in trees as offerings. In Eastern Europe, coins etched with a sunburst and a child's hand were buried in fields before harvest tokens of blessing from the lost saints who once walked among the wheat. Others believed a darker tale, that the children had not been led astray by men, but sacrificed used by powers who saw their innocence as currency. That the church, hungry for narrative control, allowed the march to happen, then buried the truth beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. These were dangerous ideas. But they did not die. In times of famine or plague, the story returned. In the year 1348, as the Black Death swept across Europe, Some towns interpreted it not as divine wrath, but as consequence. "We forgot the children," they said. "And now the earth forgets us." Flagellants marched through the streets, lashing themselves not only for sins, but in mourning. They painted crosses not on their tunics, but on their bare skin. Some chanted in Latin, others in local dialects that hadn't been written down in centuries. Their voices rose like ghosts trying to pierce the dome of heaven. The idea that children carried truth became a quiet rebellion. When new religious movements emerged from mystic sects to proto-Protestants, they often told their own version of the Children's Crusade. In one, the children reached Jerusalem and found it empty. In another, they never arrived because they were too pure, and heaven claimed them before men could ruin them. In each retelling, the world's cruelty remained unchanged. But the children, they became eternal. And in that eternity, they haunted power. Because the children exposed a truth no ruler wanted to face, that spiritual authority, when hollow, can demand sacrifice and still offer nothing in return. They walked out of history and into symbol. They became every believer who asked too much of God and received silence. Every pilgrim who died before reaching the shrine. Every soul who wandered far, not to conquer, but to be healed and was broken instead. Even in art, they reappeared. In tapestries, hidden in the corners, pale figures looking eastward while knights feasted. In stained glass, behind saints and kings, the outline of a boy without shoes, haloed in gold, forgotten by name, but not by presence. And in dreams they returned. Monks reported visions of empty cities where children sang. Nobles dreamt of being led through deserts by young guides with burned feet. Women on the edge of madness claimed they had nursed a divine child who spoke only of dust, sun, and a sea that would not part. The church, for all its might, could not control dreams. And so the Children's Crusade lived on, not in doctrine, but in imagination. Not in orders from Rome, but in the silent covenant between pain and belief. They became part of the architecture of Europe's soul. And like all true myths, they asked not for belief, only to be remembered. The silence that followed the Children's Crusade was not one of peace. It was the kind of silence that comes when a truth is too painful to speak. Cities went on, kings ruled, wars continued, but somewhere in the heart of Europe, something had been torn open, and nothing ever quite filled the space. What does a culture do when it loses its innocence not in battle, but in its own reflection? It weaves stories, it builds legends, it hides its shame behind symbols. In some regions of France and Germany, young boys who died suddenly were no longer buried nameless. Their graves were marked with small wooden staffs, pilgrim staves bound with a strip of linen bearing a stitched white cross. These makeshift memorials became known as steps to heaven. No priest sanctified them. No church condoned them. But the people understood. These were not children lost to disease or chance. These were the echoes of those who had marched and vanished. Over time, the story changed, like all oral histories. In some towns, the children became heroes who reached the gates of Jerusalem and disappeared into heaven. In others, they were betrayed by the Pope himself, sold into slavery by captains flying false banners. And in still others, they were transformed into angelic protectors who wandered the earth unseen, rescuing the faithful in times of peril. None of these versions were true. All of them were real. Because the Children's Crusade had stopped being an event. It had become a parable, a warning, a prayer, a wound that Europe wore beneath its armor of faith. Even into the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers wrote of the children not with reverence, but with awe. Voltaire called it the most terrible poem ever walked. Rousseau described it as a prayer that turned into a scream. They could not deny its power, even if they mocked its premise. Because no matter the age, medieval, reformist, rational, revolutionary, there was something in the story that unsettled, a mirror too pure, a question too raw. What happens when the innocent take the lead? What happens when they are lost? The Children's Crusade never needed statues to be remembered. It never needed canonization. Its power was in its emptiness. Its truth lay in the fact that no one really knew what had happened, but everyone felt what it meant. It meant that faith, unchecked by wisdom, could devour its own future. It meant that the line between miracle and madness was thinner than parchment. It meant that sometimes the most dangerous journey was the one taken with hope and nothing else. And so they march still, in story, in sorrow, in the space between what we believe and what we dare to follow. The farther the centuries moved from that summer of 1212, the louder the silence around it became. Chroniclers no longer mentioned the names of the vanished children. Royal scribes erased their march from official documents, even the papal archives, once bloated with debates about penance and indulgence. Let the memory drift into forgetfulness. But memory does not need permission to survive. It clings to the breath of lullabies. It hides in symbols carved into forgotten corners of cathedrals. It lives in the fearful hush that descends when a tale begins. There once were children who believed they could reach God. In Germany, some monasteries reported strange sightings centuries later, visitors cloaked in dust, barefoot, who spoke no clear language but wept at the sight of a crucifix. Pilgrims, perhaps. Madmen, perhaps. But local friars whispered that these were the walking ghosts, survivors of the Children's Crusade, cursed with eternal wandering. The church condemned such stories, yet they spread, carried in the mouths of the poor and the prayers of the desperate. And still, the legends multiplied. In one, the children never reached the sea, but instead were swallowed by a forest that had no end, where the trees whispered ancient truths and time moved like fog. In another, they crossed the sea not by ship, but by miracle walking upon the waves. Their voices joined in a single chant, so pure it turned the ocean calm. Some say they reached the gates of Jerusalem and found no walls, only light. Each story contradicts the others. Each story is believed by someone, because the Children's Crusade was not remembered for what it accomplished, but for what it attempted. A march not of conquest, but of faith in its rawest, most dangerous form, and that made it immortal. In art, the image of the child pilgrim became a recurring motif. Paintings from the 14th and 15th centuries began to depict young, barefoot figures with crosses sewn into their garments, not as saints, not as martyrs, but as silent observers. Sometimes they watched battles. Sometimes they stood behind kings. In one tapestry from Flanders, a child in a white tunic is seen holding a candle as Rome burns. Who was this child? The records say nothing, but the people knew. He was one of them, one of the vanished, one of the innocent who dared to believe, and through him, the world was reminded that belief without protection is perilous. That innocence, when betrayed, does not disappear, it transforms. Some said the children became angels, others, revenants. But all agreed they never stopped marching, through time, through memory, through the cracked foundation of every empire built without grace. By the time the age of discovery dawned, and ships set sail for the edge of the world, many carried with them icons not of saints, but of child crusaders, not to bless conquest, but to plead, let this journey be different. It never was. The farther the crusade receded into history, the more it hardened into archetype, a mass of unnamed children, driven not by orders or arms, but by something older, an ache for purity, for salvation, for a Jerusalem not found on any map. That image fragile, luminous, Doomed became a haunting paradox, a march toward heaven that led instead into silence. In villages nestled between mountains, elders spoke of the march not as history, but as prophecy. They said the children would return when the world had grown too cynical, when the bells no longer rang for prayer, and kings knelt only for coin. They would come barefoot again, carrying not swords, but songs. And this time, they would not seek Jerusalem. They would build it, wherever they stood. These stories were told around fires, over wine, in the hush of winter. No one wrote them down, but everyone remembered. Even in the Renaissance, an age that championed reason, art, and science, the children did not vanish. Leonardo da Vinci once scribbled in a margin, "The soul of a child, led across the sea, weighs more than any cathedral." No one knows what he meant, but the line survived, passed among painters and poets like a sacred riddle. Theologians wrestled with the tale. Was it divine madness? Was it judgment? Or was it a cry that heaven chose not to answer? Each theory faltered, because the story was not meant to be solved. It was meant to be felt, and feel it they did. Every time a new war broke out in the name of faith, the children's ghostly procession rose again, not to fight, but to remind, to accuse. To ask a question that pierced more deeply than any sermon, is this what God asked of you? By the 19th century, the Children's Crusade had become an emblem of romantic tragedy. Poets penned verses not about knights, but about vanished pilgrims whose only weapon was belief. In opera houses, composers wrote dirges filled with choral echoes of young voices calling across stormy seas. In Germany, a legend took root that when the last church bell in Europe falls silent, and the last torch of empire is extinguished, the children will walk again not eastward, but inward, into every heart that has forgotten how to hope without fear. Even secular thinkers were not immune. Sigmund Freud once mused that the Children's Crusade was the first mass dream Europe ever shared, and perhaps its last uncorrupted one. Carl Jung, more mystic than doctor, claimed the children symbolized the unconscious soul of the West, forever exiled, forever searching. And so the march continued, not on roads, but in imaginations, in every protest by the young, in every hymn sung by candlelight, in every rebellion that began not in anger, but in longing. They became not martyrs, not saints, but questions, unanswered, undiminished, unrelenting. And in that form, the Children's Crusade became eternal, not because they reached Jerusalem, but because they made the world ask what it would sacrifice to find its soul again. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. Cathedrals were built, then bombed. Theologies evolved. Languages died. Borders shifted. But the children remained, not in flesh, but in the ache behind every attempt to reclaim paradise. Because in their story, blurred though it is, lies something universal, the unbearable hope that the pure can walk unscathed through a corrupt world, that faith alone can move mountains, that innocence, if multiplied enough, can become strength. It is a beautiful lie. Or perhaps the truest truth we cannot bear to face. Artists still painted them, but no longer with halos. Now, they had hollow eyes, empty satchels, dirty hands clutching makeshift banners. One stood in a trench beside a fallen soldier in World War I. One walked beside a slave ship in an abolitionist mural. One knelt in a pile of rubble during the Blitz. The march continued not eastward, but everywhere. And though they no longer claimed Jerusalem, their direction remained the same toward light, toward redemption, toward something better than this world could offer. Modern historians tried to pin it down. Who were they? Really? How many? Where exactly did they go? Some argued there were two separate crusades. Others said it was a case of misinterpreted pilgrimage, inflated by legend. Ships were counted, ports analysed, ledgers examined. But the truth escaped every ledger, because this was not a story of numbers. It was a story of belief taken too far, or maybe not far enough. And so the children walked on. They appeared in dreams of saints and madmen, in revolutionary chants sung by youth demanding justice, in the quiet panic of parents watching their children march into ideologies older than their understanding. Every movement that speaks of purity bears their ghost. Every cause that exalts sacrifice awakens their echo. And in every candlelit vigil, every march through rain, every whisper of maybe we can change the world, the children's crusade begins again. They do not ask to be followed. They do not warn. They only walk barefoot, breathless, burning with a faith that could not be corrupted. And that is why they are remembered. Not because they reached Jerusalem, but because they reminded the world what it means to try. Somewhere in the tapestry of history, the children's crusade unraveled from event into symbol. What began as a misled pilgrimage by thousands of innocents became a mirror too painful for any civilization to stare into for long. And so it lingered just outside the reach of facts, humming in the background of sermons, hidden in the folds of stained glass and hymn. Because there's something terrifying about a movement that begins not in greed, nor conquest, but in hope. Hope, unguarded, is dangerous. It cannot be negotiated with, cannot be taxed, cannot be commanded. The children marched because they truly believed that purity could accomplish what power could not. That faith, unarmed, uncorrupted, was stronger than swords. Their error was not in daring too little, but in daring too much. And so the world crushed them, and then forgot them, or tried to. But across Europe, traces remained. In 15th century Czech towns, stories emerged of pale figures who wandered into villages during storms, muttering prayers in forgotten tongues. In the Balkans, legends spoke of silent children who guided travelers away from bandits. In Florence, a single fresco in a forgotten chapel shows a crowd of young pilgrims standing at the sea's edge, their feet lifted slightly above the waves. There was no inscription. None was needed. They were remembered not by history books, but by shadows, by questions, by the hush that fell in village halls when someone asked, didn't they ever come back? And yet what would coming back have even meant? The world they left behind was no safer than the one they sought. Some historians would later claim that remnants of the Crusade inspired reform movements centuries later, that the tale of the lost children planted seeds in the hearts of those who would challenge the church, demand education, advocate for the rights of the young. If so, then their journey did not end in Marseille or in the slave markets of North Africa. It continued in rebellion, in music, in doubt. The Crusade became a kind of liturgy for the disillusioned, a sacred grief for those who realize too late that belief is not enough, that purity is not protection, and that the institutions meant to shepherd the soul can sometimes devour it instead. In this way, the children became not only victims, they became prophets. And prophecy rarely ends in comfort. So their march continues not in history, but in spirit. In every song sung by children who do not understand its sorrow. In every pilgrimage made by the desperate. In every march where feet blister not from distance, but from disappointment. Their legacy is not carved in stone. It is carried in silence. The kind that falls when we realize how often we trade innocence for empire. The silence surrounding their fate became more deafening with time, not because the world forgot them, but because remembering them too clearly hurt too much. No one wanted to dwell on the truth that it wasn't God or storms or foreign swords that had destroyed them. It was us, parents who let them go, bishops who failed to stop them, merchants who exploited them, priests who blessed them, and in every generation that followed, the same roles repeated: the hopeful, the powerful, the indifferent. As centuries passed, the children began to haunt not only memory but language. In some parts of Europe, calling someone a Jerusalem child became an idiom for describing dreamers, radicals, or those who followed impossible ideals. It was not always a compliment, but it was never a lie. Somewhere deep in Europe's soul, the children had become a conscience. During the Reformation, radical sects invoked the Children's Crusade to justify breaking from the Catholic Church. See what they did to the innocent. They cried. They blessed kings and cursed children. For Lutherans and Anabaptists, the children were a symbol of purity, betrayed a rallying cry against corruption. Even the Enlightenment could not fully escape their shadow. Voltaire, never one to spare religion his ridicule, referred to the Crusade as a sermon without words spoken by broken feet. In salons across Paris and Vienna, the Children's Crusade was dissected not for its theology, but for its psychology. How had so many followed? What does it say about humanity that belief alone could uproot an entire generation? There were no answers, only stories. And still, they walked, if not in flesh, then in thought, into revolutions, into songs, into myths that grew not less potent, but more dangerous. In Russia, tales emerged of a lost band of child pilgrims who had wandered into the Caucasus and founded a hidden village of peace. In Spain, a heretical sect claimed that the children had been reincarnated as stars, watching and waiting until the world was ready for truth again. In every one of these stories, the children were no longer just lost. They were watching, waiting, and the message was always the same: when the world forgets its soul, the children will rise, not with weapons, but with wonder. And that's what terrified the world most. The legend and the lesson, how the march was remembered. They should have disappeared. They should have become a footnote, one more tragedy in a bloody, bewildered age. Just another tale of dust and failure on the road to Jerusalem. But the Children's Crusade refused to vanish. Instead, it slipped past the watchmen of history, climbed down the rafters of cathedrals, and began whispering into the dreams of the world. Because while the march itself ended in ruin, the idea it carried, the raw, radiant belief that innocence could change the world, never died. And that idea is dangerous. In the centuries that followed, the children's story would become a touchstone echoed by every generation that dared to rise with clean hearts and impossible hopes. Revolutionaries in Paris spoke of them. Pilgrims in America cited them. Protesters in Prague, students in Tehran, monks in Myanmar all knew, without saying, what it meant to march barefoot towards something sacred and be crushed for it. They were not remembered through monuments. They were remembered through mirrors, because in every new uprising, the same shape emerges: the young, facing off against the old, the unarmed, staring down battalions, the dreamers, walking straight into the teeth of history. This is the deeper legacy of the Children's Crusade, not that they failed, but that they showed the cost of purity in an impure world. Their story is a warning and a dare. It says, if you follow only your faith, you may be devoured. It also says, if no one ever follows their faith, the world will rot. That tension lives in every protest chant, every candlelit vigil, every whispered prayer for change. It is the reason nations fear youth. It is the reason churches tremble at unsanctioned miracles. The children proved that belief is real. They also proved that belief is not enough. And so the myth of their march keeps returning, not to retell the past, but to judge the present. Every time we let greed mask itself as governance, every time we trade truth for comfort, the children rise again, not in flesh, but in story, a reminder, a reckoning, a voice beneath the noise saying, this world is not what you promised us. We don't teach the Children's Crusade in schools, not really. Not the way we teach kings or treaties or formal wars. It doesn't fit the neat boxes. Too ambiguous, too mystical, too painful. Instead, it lives in symbols, shadows, stories told in passing by professors who lower their voices at the mention of it, as if afraid to wake something older than history. And perhaps they should be afraid, because buried inside the tale is a raw nerve, a truth we haven't dared to fully examine, that every empire, every religion, every ideology eventually fails its children. The Children's Crusade is not an anomaly. It is a mirror that reflects what happens when institutions founded on righteousness choose self-preservation over compassion, when leaders mistake ritual for holiness, when people conflate authority with truth. In that sense, the march was not medieval. It was eternal. You see it every time a young voice is silenced for asking too loudly. Why you see it when institutions designed to protect instead devour. When young lives are bartered for policy. When a generation rises not with weapons but with questions and is met with fear. The children walked toward Jerusalem, but what they really sought was meaning. They carried the burdens their parents couldn't. They inherited a broken world and thought maybe, just maybe, their innocence could fix it, could heal it, could redeem it. They were wrong. And that is the great unspoken tragedy. Not just that they died, but that we have learned so little from their dying. Because we do it still, not with crusades, but with promises, with systems that say, trust us, follow us, sacrifice for us, and then watch as youth walks off a cliff, again and again, for a dream that was never real. And yet, they keep walking. Every generation has its march, and each one, in some way, resurrects the Children's Crusade. Whether in streets lit by torches or screens lit by protest live streams, whether they wear crosses or carry signs, whether they seek Jerusalem or justice, the children come again. Always too young, always too brave, always too easily forgotten, and always. They remind us the measure of a civilization is not in its monuments, but in how it treats those who believe enough to demand something better. There's a reason the story of the Children's Crusade resurfaces in times of upheaval. It's not just nostalgia or tragedy, it's recognition. Recognition that the patterns have not changed, that the world still makes promises it does not intend to keep, that it still convinces the young to bleed for ideals crafted by the old. In the 20th century, the ghosts of the crusading children stood at the edge of every battlefield, not with swords, but with questions. They were there in the trenches of Verdun, watching boys barely older than themselves die for lines drawn on maps by men in parlors. They wandered through Hiroshima, unburned, but unseen. They hovered over Berlin in 1989, where children once again pushed against a wall built on fear and forgotten hope. In the 21st century, they march differently. Now they wear sneakers, not sandals. Now they carry phones instead of psalters. Now their Jerusalem is not a city, but a world that must survive. You can hear them in the chants of students marching for climate justice. See them in the tears of girls denied education. Feel them in the trembling hands of boys carrying signs that read, "Am I next?" Every time children rise, not in hate, but in holy urgency, they resurrect the spirit of that lost crusade. They remind us what belief looks like before it's broken. And they terrify us, because deep down, we remember how the first crusading children were betrayed, and we're afraid we'll do it again. But we already are. We ask the next generation to fix what we refuse to change. We hand them disasters wrapped in slogans. We praise their courage, then abandon them when the fire gets too close. And still they march, still they sing, still they hope. Because that is their birthright, and their curse to believe in the world more than the world believes in itself. They do not always know the story of the Children's Crusade, but they live it. Every step they take is a question hurled at the sky. Why must we carry this? And though no voice answers from the clouds, the earth itself seems to whisper back, because you still can. No one built a monument for them. No grand basilica was raised. No pope canonized their suffering. Their names, if they were ever recorded, have long since been lost to wind, war, and indifference, and yet they endure, not as heroes, not as saints, but as a question that outlives kings, that rises in smoke over burning cities, that flickers in the eyes of every child born into a world too broken to deserve them. The children's crusade did not fail. It revealed the limits of faith when decoupled from wisdom, the cruelty of institutions that prize order over compassion, the danger of trusting in banners rather than truth. And still, they walked. Perhaps that's why the story will not die. Because somewhere, deep in the marrow of the human spirit, we need to believe that innocence can still rise, that even when it is devoured, it leaves a trace, a tremor, a whisper. They remind us that every movement, spiritual, political, or personal, begins the same way with someone young enough, brave enough, or foolish enough to believe the world could be better. And they remind us, too, of the cost, because the world is not kind to purity. It fears it, it buries it, and when it cannot silence it, it forgets it. But the forgotten walk still, not just as ghosts in old cities or names in dusty ledgers, but in us. In every child who sings when told to be quiet, in every youth who walks into the world carrying nothing but conviction, in every generation that inherits ashes and still dares to plant something green. We are their legacy. We are their unfinished song. And maybe that is enough, not to answer the questions, but to keep asking them, not to reclaim Jerusalem, but to remember why it mattered, not to undo the past, but to walk one step, one hope, one voice at a time towards something more honest than victory, toward grace, toward memory, toward home. They say stories are how we make sense of the world, but not all stories offer comfort. Some linger like a wound that never quite closes, stories that ache instead of heal. The Children's Crusade is one of those, not because of its tragedy, but because of its truth, because in a world that celebrates might and mocks innocence, their march reminds us that the human soul was never meant to fit into systems designed for conquest. What makes their story endure isn't just the scale of the loss. It's the purity of the question they asked. Simply by existing, can faith alone move the world? And in answering no, history condemned itself. We call them naive. But what is more naive, to believe that the world can change, or to believe it never will? So they walked, and failed, and vanished. And in doing so, they revealed more about us than any king, crusade, or council ever could. We who came after have done our best to bury them. We called them myths. We questioned the records. We rationalized the betrayal. Because it is easier to doubt they ever walked than to admit we would have let them walk still. And yet, they rise. In every child who protests. In every voice that dares to dream without permission. In every broken place where someone says, there must be more than this. They are there. Not as ghosts, but as truth made flesh. They do not demand monuments, only memory. And perhaps that is the only Jerusalem left to find, not a city of stone, but a place inside us where belief still burns. Not for war, not for conquest, but for something higher, something fragile, something holy. So when the world grows too loud, when the noise of fear and power drowns out the small voices, listen again. Listen for the sound of barefoot footsteps, the rustle of cloth crosses, the quiet defiance of those who walk not to win, but to witness. The children never reached their holy city, but they became its gatekeepers, not in maps, but in meaning. And if we dare to follow, it will not be toward a shrine, it will be toward ourselves. In the centuries that followed, as cities crumbled, and new empires rose from the ashes of old. The memory of the children never truly left. They were not canonized, not etched into stone reliefs beside saints and sovereigns. Instead, they became part of the unspoken heritage of Europe, an echo passed down not in doctrine, but in song, in sorrow, in silence. And in that silence, something powerful grew. Parents who had once sent their children with blessings began to question the cost of obedience. Monks who had copied tales of martyrdom now hesitated at the part where the young are devoured by the very causes they champion. Artists, poets, rebels, they reached back toward that march, toward those forgotten faces, to draw something raw and real from the myth, a warning, a mirror, and sometimes a prayer. Because in the children's footsteps lies a terrible kind of grace, not the grace of success, but the grace of those who chose the better road and still fell, who gave their hearts to something greater and were shattered not by enemies, but by indifference. And that kind of grace haunts the soul. It demands to be reckoned with. You feel it in the whispered doubts of a soldier kneeling beside a battlefield grave. You see it in the eyes of a teacher watching students walk out of school, chanting for a future they may never see. You hear it in every song written by those too young to be bitter and too brave to be silent. This is the legacy of the Children's Crusade, not a pilgrimage, not a battle, not a failure, a heartbeat, still pulsing beneath centuries of noise and politics and power, still asking, through time, what is your Jerusalem, and what are you willing to become to reach it? It's not a comfortable question. It was never meant to be, but it is the one they left us. And in remembering them not as saints, not as fools, but as children who dared, we may find the courage to ask it. 2. The true tragedy of the Children's Crusade isn't only that they were betrayed, it's that the betrayal became acceptable, rationalized, faded into the margins of memory. That generation, after generation, forgot what it meant to believe so fiercely that they would leave everything behind, walk across a continent, and ask nothing in return, but a promise never kept. Their bones are gone. The ships that carried them sank or burned. The documents were lost in wars and revolutions. But somehow, the story endured. Not because it was preserved, but because it refused to die. Every society that inherits this tale carries a secret shame, the knowledge that they did not deserve those children, that we, with our rules and walls and doctrines, could not hold the kind of fire they brought. We feared it, we used it, then we snuffed it out, and we are still doing it. Today's children don't wear crosses stitched in cloth, but they carry banners, they carry songs, they carry questions too dangerous for the world to answer. Questions about justice, about climate, about truth. And each time they rise, the old systems react not with understanding, but with fear. Because systems do not know how to speak to purity. They only know how to bend it, exploit it, break it. But still, they come. And we must decide what part we will play, this time the priest with the blessing, the merchant with the bargain, the general with the plan, or something else, something braver, something new. The legacy of the Children's Crusade is not just a myth of the past, it is a prophecy, a pattern, a call. It says when the world becomes unbearable, the innocent will rise, not because they have power, but because they have nothing left to lose. It says the road to redemption will always begin with the unheard, with the young, with those foolish enough to walk barefoot into fire and believe it can be turned into light. And it says, finally, you cannot stop them. You can only choose whether to march beside them or watch them vanish, again, into the dark. So ask yourself, not as a historian, but as a human, when they come again, and they will, what will you do? Stand aside, offer gold, or walk, not for conquest, not for glory, but to become, if only once in your life, a witness to something too pure to last and too sacred to forget. And if you truly walk in the spirit of those children, you will not be greeted with banners. You will not be cheered. The world does not welcome pilgrims who do not seek profit. The path is long and lonely and laced with the bones of those who went before. But walk anyway, because something sacred still hums beneath the dust of their silence. Something unclaimed. Something left behind not in failure, but in faith that someone, someday, would pick it up again, not to relive the march, but to redeem it, to finish it, not with swords, but with truth, not with empire, but with presence. And so their story remains, unfinished and alive, tucked behind the noise of history, a soft flame, waiting, not for kings, not for generals, but for someone brave enough to listen again, to remember that once the world was confronted by innocence so fierce it frightened tyrants, and they were only children. Maybe that's the most terrifying truth of all, not that they failed, but that they believed. And maybe, just maybe, we are still standing in the shadow of their belief, still trying to live up to a question they asked with every blistered step. What does it truly mean to be faithful? Until we answer, their crusade does not end. It merely waits. The world changed, but not in the way they hoped. Jerusalem was never reclaimed by their hands. The Holy Land remained out of reach, and yet their steps, those soft, dust-covered footsteps, echoed farther than any sword ever could. Because belief, when carried by the pure of heart, doesn't end where the road ends. It spills beyond maps, beyond monuments. It becomes part of the soul of the world. And their story, half history, half hymn, became a seed, planted in silence, watered by tears. It grew in strange places, in the hearts of mothers staring out over empty fields, in the trembling hands of rebels writing songs by candlelight, in the eyes of a teacher watching a child raise their hand and ask, "Why not better?" Because that's what they truly left behind. Not a conquest, not a kingdom, but a question still walking beside us, unaged by time. What if belief was never meant to win? What if its power lies not in triumph, but in trying, even when the world is cruel, trying, even when the leaders lie, trying, because to give up would be worse than death. They walked because they believed there was more than what the priests had said, more than what the kings had offered, more than the tired rituals of a church too bound to empire. And maybe, in that, they glimpsed something truer than doctrine, something holy, something we've been running from ever since. You can't build a church big enough to hold that kind of faith. You can't legislate it. You can't sell it. You can only carry it quietly, tremblingly, the way a child might carry a candle through the night. And maybe that's the final lesson they left us. That belief isn't about banners. It's about burdens, about carrying something sacred even when your feet bleed, your voice shakes, and the world mocks you for trying. The children taught us that, and we have never truly recovered. Because deep down, we all know we were supposed to walk with them. We were supposed to protect them. Instead, we watched. And now, we remember, not to wallow in guilt, but to choose differently next time. To listen sooner, to follow humbler, to believe, not in the conquest of Jerusalem, but in the healing of what we abandoned along the way. And in doing so, perhaps, finally we come closer to that holy place they sought. Not in stone, but in soul. Not in banners, but in memory. And maybe that is what they were marching toward all along. The streets they walked have long since been renamed. Fields they crossed now lie under cities, buried beneath centuries of stone and steel. Yet their path has never faded, not truly. Because they were not carving a road into geography. They were carving it into the soul. And that kind of path cut from conviction, lit by heartbreak, never disappears. It weaves through our collective memory like a hidden current beneath the surface of history. Whenever the world grows too loud, too cruel, too cold, their road reappears. You see it in every child who stands alone in a crowd and does not lower their eyes. In every small voice that rises above the noise to say, "This is not enough." They built no cities, won no battles. Their names, if we ever had them, were lost. But their defiance, their sorrow, their sacred refusal to be quiet, that endures, and it infects us. In the quiet moments, in the stories we cannot explain, in the dreams we have where a vast crowd is moving, barefoot, towards something we cannot see but somehow know. They remind us what belief looks like before power poisons it, what hope sounds like before the drums of war drown it out, what it means to walk towards something not for glory but because your heart tells you to. That kind of truth, fragile, foolish, fierce, is the only kind that matters in the end. And the children knew it. That's why they terrify us. Because we remember. We remember that once. A generation dared to believe without permission. And we failed them. But if we remember deeply enough, if we stop trying to forget, we may yet find them again. Not on a battlefield, not in a shrine, but in ourselves. In the part of us that still believes, that still dares, that still walks. They were never supposed to matter. Not to kings, nor councils, nor chroniclers. They were too small, too poor, too unarmed, too inconvenient. But somehow, against every weight history placed on them, they mattered more than those who wrote the laws or signed the treaties. Because they dreamed, because they walked. Because when told the world was as it is and could not be changed, they refused. And in doing so, they left a mark that no erasure could reach. Not a mark of conquest, but of conscience. We've built so many temples since then. Temples of politics, of profit, of silence. But none of them have ever answered the question those children left behind. What is sacred, if not them? What is holy? If not the courage to keep walking when you have nothing left but hope? Their story was never about winning. It was about meaning. It was about a wound that became a mirror that became a myth, and a myth that became a memory, passed down, not in books, but in blood. And so we carry them not as saints, not as warnings, but as the question we cannot stop asking: what world are we leaving? And who will walk to fix it? That question will rise again. And when it does, we will see them again, not in robes or sandals, but in eyes that still shine with the dangerous light of belief. The children's crusade was not the end of innocence. It was the beginning of its rebellion. And that rebellion is not over. It never will be. And so, the march ended, not with victory, not even with defeat, but with silence. A silence that spread through history like mist, settling between the lines of chronicles and the stones of cathedrals. But it never truly vanished. It waits, in every act of defiant hope, in every child who dreams of justice, in every footstep that dares to walk away from fear and towards something better. The children's crusade may be over, but its question remains. Not a cry for war, but a whisper. Can innocence still lead the way? That whisper, fragile, foolish, fierce, still waits for us to answer.